Hey, good morning, Soma Eastside Church, and whoever else is listening in to this podcast. We are starting something new, and I would love to spend time each week talking with you via this medium. So, the purposes of this is to try out a new form of communication during COVID. There's so many things to talk about, and there's just not enough time on Sunday mornings. And so I thought this would be an easy way to connect with many of you. Would love to use this also as we go along to introduce new people to you. It might be people that have just had a baby that you introduce you to, or new people in the church, or just seeing some old faces. This will give us more time for that, and because I will basically just be recording over Zoom, there won't be any difficulties with the typical COVID restrictions. Thirdly, I'd love to use the vodcast to go deeper on sermon topics. Sometimes immediately following the sermon, I'll get a question, or I'll need to cut out something in the sermon for the sake of time. This will give me some opportunity to talk about it at greater detail. Of course, I can use this medium to give more information about what the church is doing at the moment, and also answer questions. So please feel free to give feedback, especially if it's positive and constructive on this. And I would love to hear from you, would love to hear your questions, would love to hear suggestions for different topics. I will probably deal with two focuses in this podcast, just basically because these are my areas of expertise. And if you see behind me on my different bookshelves, I have bookshelves on this side and this side of the room. And this side is primarily theology. And this is seminary training. I got my degree at Cedarville University, where I had a minor in Bible, a minor in Greek, and a major in history. And then following Cedarville, I did some master's level work in biblical counseling. And so there's definitely some biblical counseling shelves over there. Then after that, I went to Tacoma, Washington, Northwest Baptist Seminary, where I got a degree in theology, better known as Master's of Ministry, just very nearly the Master's in Theology there, before I left for what I believed were greener pastures at Washington State University. There, I got my master's degree in history, where I did a thesis on the experience of a soldier in World War I, why they fought, and then PhD in history, which dealt with how non-government organizations affected U.S. foreign policy. So that's a PhD in U.S. diplomatic history. So all those things for the master's and PhD are on that side, theology primarily that side, but they do integrate quite a bit on the shelves, and most certainly in my life. So we'll be talking about a lot of those topics on the vodcast. So this week, we're going to start off by talking with Tyler Saldaña. And Tyler is the youth pastor at Soma Eastside. And he is a courageous Christian. And he is a dear friend, and often speaks into topics that affect the culture today with our kids. And so Tyler today is going to be talking about his experience with the book, The Color of Compromise. And as you can imagine, during this time of political turmoil, this book is controversial. And it's controversial in the greater world, and it's controversial in our congregation. However, Tyler has not shied away from this controversy. He has courageously jumped into the middle of it, and therefore is taking a group of our youth through it. And so I wanted to ask him some questions about it. I wanted to interact a little bit as both a pastor and a historian dealing with this. So I'm going to invite Tyler in to the room, the Zoom room here. And then we're going to jump into this topic. But I'm so glad you're here. Please get a pencil and paper, or maybe just a keyboard, jot down some notes, jot down some questions, And certainly the next vodcast episode, I will deal with these questions, answer whatever questions you've got, or maybe just read your profound objections to whatever Tyler and I discuss. So glad you're with us, and we will welcome Tyler to the vodcast right now. All right, everybody, I've got Tyler Saldaña here, who is the youth pastor at Soma Eastside Church. He's also an accomplished online writer and a fine husband and father, and outstanding member of our community. So thanks for joining us, Tyler. Let's talk about TSB. And I've got a list of questions here. I'm just going to roll through them, but just would love to have a discussion with you. And as I have encouraged people, if you've got questions, send them in. We will do our best. Probably me, but it could be that if I get enough questions, I'll ask Tyler back for a follow-up. But ask questions. This is part of the reason for having it, so you can interact. So, all right. So the book is called Color of Compromise, and it has been very popular in evangelical circles. And I certainly enjoyed reading it. The topic is super painful, but I was super grateful for it. Tyler, as far as you can tell, what do you see as TSB's purpose for writing The Color of Compromise?
I'd say twofold. Primarily to lovingly give an account for Jesus followers of how the church in America has so often been on the side of racism since really the early colonists of 1619. So, and then as well as just to call us, I think, as we get that history and see how many times our forefathers in the church fell short, to call us to a different way and encourage us to ways in unity and racial reconciliation and just how that's really at the heart of the gospel. So yeah, I'd say that's his main. It is a harsh, confrontational, but in a loving manner, I think. If you listen to Dumar, his podcast, he's just very humble, encouraging, trying to communicate with the broader church, not just the Black church. So
often when people read books, I see them ignore the preface, ignore the foreword, and just jump right to chapter 1. When you taught this to the youth, did you have them go through the introductory chapters, or did you skip those?
Yeah, so the foreword by Lecrae, and then no, we were reading the whole thing. So, but tomorrow morning we work on chapter 6. But there was one student, I won't say who, but didn't think we read the foreword. I was like, no, we're reading it all. Yes, we did read it all.
How did they respond to the foreword? I love not the foreword, the preface introduction where TSB's talking about his purpose. How did the students respond to that? Did they seem like they got why TSB was writing the book?
I think so. I think for students today, they're definitely aware. It seems like each generation is maybe a little bit more aware than the previous, right? Or of just present day manifestations of sin, and we'd call racism sin, right? And so, I think it's something at the forefront for them. And if anything, there was a big hunger when I asked students, "What do you guys want to talk about this fall?" And there was quite a few on the student survey wanted to talk through racism and the church, and what our role is in combating or eradicating or confronting. And so they weren't really shocked by it. They're like, no, we see this. So
I loved his definition, or he talks about it several different ways. I love that he talked about his goal being to speak the truth in love to the American church, and in some ways be equal time. And I know that our congregation has a lot of different views, just different political and ideological views. So I'll use an example from someone on the right wing.
Hmm.
Rush Limbaugh people will confront him about being one-sided.
Hmm.
And instead of saying, no, I'm objective, he said, no, I'm one-sided, but
Hmm.
I'm equal time,
Hmm.
which means that there is so much, from his perspective, there is so much liberal reporting.
Hmm.
There is and most reporters identify and donate to the Democratic Party. So he uses that to say that his program is not going to be balanced. He's just equal time. He's going to make up for that slant. And
Hmm.
so I see that in this book, in that so much of American history has been triumphal,
Hmm.
has majored on all of the good things that have happened in American history.
Hmm.
And in church history, it's the same way. Often, not always, but often we highlight the things that are good. And so I love that Tisby is taking this opportunity to be equal time, to
Right.
fill in a lot of those gaps.
Yeah.
I think that's healthy and good. And he said that the complicit church is effectively devalues people of color historically. And then
Hmm.
he said the courageous church embraces racial and ethnic diversity, stands against any person, policy, or practice that would dim the glory of God reflected in the life of human beings from every tribe and tongue. These words are a call to abandon complicit Christianity and move towards courageous
Hmm.
Christianity.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be beautiful to see that our next generation
Hmm.
really embrace this courageous Christianity, that when there's obvious wrongs in front of us, that we just say, no more.
Right. Yeah, definitely. That is he bookends the end of the book with that, and with the example of Joshua, right? And with the be strong and courageous, and talking through that of the charge for us going forward. So yeah, I mean, that is the call to, instead of be complicit or compromise, yeah, we be courageous as Jesus followers in this day and age. So that's the hope. That's the prayer. That's our goal.
Indeed.
Yeah.
How do you see what's most effective about the book, as far as how do you see Tisby achieving this purpose of taking the church and encouraging it towards being courageous rather than complicit?
Well, for such a concise book, there's a lot of depth and breadth in it. And so I think just that he traces from, each chapter is a different section of history all the way up until the last couple of years, right? And so just seeing the timeline, sketching some hard lines or dotted lines as to how we got to where we're at, and really how just seeing the heart of compromise, and how it previously was in the law, right, and in systems and in structures, but even as those have been broken down or eradicated or slowly beaten down, that they still play out in other ways, in subtle ways. And so understanding that heart behind complicity and compromise, and being able to try and pinpoint it, I think, and being reflective and humble, and trying to think through, man, how might I do the same thing today, or see other image bearers of God in a similar manner, as what we so often we look down on people of the past, and we're like, we wouldn't do that. But I'm not sure that's entirely the case, if we're honest. So yeah, I think that's one of the main ways that he was able to be effective, was just tracing through, even talking about some heroes of our, American church, and showing even where, different areas that they may have fell on the sidelines. I think of even the Billy Graham reference, and even how Billy repented of some of the stuff he chose to be on the sidelines of, and stuff. So seeing that, and reflecting on that, and just realizing, yeah, we're all going to fall short, and that humble approach, I think, allows us to walk forward, in humility, and able to just, be patient, and take steps forward,
Were there
rather
a
than just
couple?
being like, it's past, we're past that, right? So,
Mm.
yeah.
Were there a couple instances that were the most memorable to you? He tells a lot of stories in the book, and
Yeah.
most of them I would describe as just painful. I just found myself, just shaking my head like, oh,
Yeah.
how could we, as people that believe in the image of God,
Hmm.
have allowed those things to go on
Right.
for so long? Why didn't more of us as the church stand up and speak out? What are some of the things that were the most memorable to you?
I'm not sure I want to totally share the exact accounts because, man, some of them, even the chapter we read this week for students, chapter 6, Reconstructing White Supremacy in the Jim Crow Era, man, just some of those stories, very graphic as to the ways we were, physically, whether it be the abuse and the lynchings and all that type of stuff, and hunting down of people not too long ago, right?
Yep.
Those very graphic accounts were just gut wrenching. I even texted the students this week of, hey, this chapter is going to be a little bit harder to read than some of the other, every chapter's got some stuff, but this one has a few graphic accounts. And in particular, the pregnant woman hung upside down, that whole account, if you recall that. I won't go into much further detail of that, but wow. I just texted students saying, give yourself some time to breathe and grieve and lament, as you read through this, because it's not gonna, it's hard to read some of that and be like, that wasn't that long ago. That's my grandparents' lifetime, or, and
Yep.
so yeah, those stories are the ones, and it seems like every chapter he either opens or sprinkles throughout a story, and I think helps us a lot. I mean, the students seem to really still connect. It comes up almost every week, the account from the beginning about the girls at the church in I forgot where that was, but where the bombing took place.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that, that account is at the beginning of the movie Selma, and just how powerful that was, at these little girls in their Sunday school dresses, and they're going to sing in the choir, and then the bombing goes off. And I think those stories really resonate, where you're able to connect and be like, that I'm no different than them, or not much different than them. So those are really what resonate with me.
Yep. Agreed. And some of those were familiar episodes to me, but I thought he did a good job of just telling the story. In many ways, I appreciate people who use history in preaching, just because it.
Oh, do you?
Yeah. It speaks to me, and in many ways, I see this book as much of a sermon or a series of sermons using historical examples than a straight up history.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate the fact that often he'll have application points for us, and even looking at the Civil War not just as a conflict between two regions, but as, in many ways, possible judgment from God based on our inability, our unwillingness to truly face the horrors of slavery, and maybe even today, some of the things that we're experiencing are, we haven't really come to terms with segregation, with redlining, with many of these things that have happened in our lifetime. I mean, you mentioned our grandparents' lifetime. To me, the hardest hitting parts of the book are the ones that are post 1970.
Yeah.
The ones that are, I mean, I was born in 73, so it's really close.
Yeah.
Really close, and probably foolish for us to think, it's gone now. It's close.
Right. Well, yeah, even that Christian University, in 98, was still, their president was still saying there shouldn't be interracial dating.
Was that Bob Jones?
Yeah, it was Bob Jones. I was like, I was 7. what, 98?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So they later recounted that in the early 2000s. I think his son, right, or grandson or something. But I was like, oh my gosh, in 98.
Yeah.
I
Really.
mean, and I do recall, one of my favorite shows is Boy Meets World from when I was a kid. And I recall, one of the main characters is a white guy, and it was scandalous that he was dating a black girl on TV. And so I guess, yeah, it puts it into context that even, this major Christian university was still saying no interracial marriage 22 years ago, or dating. Wow. So yeah, those things, I'm like, wow, it's not that far. What did that do to shape a generation of people?
Yep. Agreed. You probably didn't listen to Steve Taylor growing up, but he was big in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his songs was about, the song title was "We Don't Need No Color Code," and that was talking about Bob Jones and that interracial dating / marriage policy. Yeah. And so it's definitely current.
Right.
So why are you reading it with Soma Eastside Youth? How do you see this playing into their discipleship?
Originally, we were going to start with Latash Morrison's Be the Bridge book. That is very, I think, more action-oriented. But I actually thought it would be more valuable to start with the context, the history, and that's really what he gets at, right? So, yeah, I think it's important for them to learn about, think through, reflect on really our history, right? And so, of our world, of our country, but I think primarily of just the church in America. And so, Jamar said, I wrote this down, that studying history remains vital. It teaches us to place people, events, and movements within the broader scope of God's work in the world. And then, he used the analogy of context as just us Christians, Bible, expositors and exegetes and stuff. And so when we read a passage, we've got to ask those questions and learn the context before we can get to the application and how we move forward with this today, right? And so, what type of writing was it? What was going on? What was the relationship between them? What was going on in that community? Why might this have been pertinent? And so similarly, he points to the history of that and how that understanding history properly, in particular for Christians and of the church, and how that will help us, inform us to make informed decisions and action steps for going forward as Jesus followers in the 21st century. So I think our students are hungry. They see, they see the stuff trending, and they see what's going on, and they see injustice and things of that sort, and inequalities, and they want to be a part of, bringing justice and acting justice in this day and age. But I think sometimes I think with this book, it shows us how much the justice had to almost come outside the church or create a separate branch of the church. We think of even learning how the church split into, African-American denominations and different denominations based on ethnicities and races. Those were only prompted because they weren't welcomed or treated as equal within the white church. And so, for so often it's starting to branch out, and they're having to find home and a place outside of the church, rather than I'd like to help them see how the gospel calls us in the church as Jesus followers to go forward bringing justice. You think of Micah 6:8, to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. You think of Jesus when he read the scroll of Isaiah and said, today this is being fulfilled in me reading this, and that's part of his kingdom, being a voice for the voiceless, bringing freedom for the captives and so forth. And so I think those are really key reasons as to why it's relevant for our students. He finished it saying, it's no different with racial justice. We have to develop an awareness of the context to properly exegete the times and apply biblical solutions. So, and then lastly, I'd say just understanding the heart of compromise, behind compromise and complicity, and seeing how that heart manifests today. He continues to say throughout the book, we see that racism doesn't go away. it just manifests in different manners. Sin doesn't go away. It just manifests in different manners. And so I think sometimes the church can almost succumb and synchronize its thinking with, secular evolutionary thinking, right? Where we think that we can eventually overcome and eradicate some sort of problem or injustice or evil. And the reality is, no, that the doctrine of sin, the doctrine of total depravity tells us that sin will always be prevalent until the kingdom is fully realized, until Jesus finally returns. And so understanding that and realizing, no, sin is subtle and it is deep and intricate, and it twists and manifests into many different avenues of our world, of our own hearts, of our systems, and so forth. And so, understanding, trying to pinpoint, what was the heart behind their compromise, so that, then we ask those hard questions of ourselves. Man, how are we potentially complicit in compromising today?
Yeah, deep. Boy, that's fascinating. Lizzie and I had a talk around the dinner table last week, just talking about how our efforts to eradicate even something as what I would consider as clearly, obviously sin as chattel slavery, how hard it is to fully eradicate it. And, when you think about how just slavery that goes on today still, I mean, a couple of years back in Bellevue,
Right.
with young women enslaved. And it's just,
Right.
persistent, but it's right in line with our Reformed theology. So so useful for us, I think, to state it. This book is also controversial. Why do you see it? Why is this book so controversial at the moment? What is it about it that makes it controversial?
Well, I'd say for a country at large, right? It's calling out, it's addressing, it's detailing and describing roughly 400 years of just, we had some good ideas, but even those good ideas, we almost from the start didn't see them as applying to everyone. And we make a lot of strides, and then there's backlash. There's a civil war, a post-civil war, where there's a lot of freedoms, but then we get into Jim Crow, and and then we get into civil rights, but then we get so there's constantly this up and down of the arc of justice, it seems like. So I think that is hard to hear, especially I just think with our American exceptional worldview, and we're taught that we're the best, and we are likely, right? What I mean, I don't know how to tell that because I'm biased. I am American, but we're one of the best nations ever, right? And likely, and from my limited perspective, but at the same time, that doesn't negate the potential, the deep flaws and wounds we had. But then I think the bigger one is just the church, right? Just how much the church, when posed with the option to be on the side of the oppressed, the downtrodden, the weak, the vulnerable, the ones without rights, how much every chapter shows the church was just on the side of racism. And so I think that's probably the biggest one.
Painful.
Yeah.
Painful. I think we take it personally. I think because most of us really dearly love this country and have a long list of reasons why.
Right.
It's painful for us to realize that we love a deeply flawed country. Because it's full of people we love but are deeply flawed. And I think anytime someone points out a flaw in us, I know whenever someone points out an obvious flaw in me, it's painful.
Right.
So I think there's a personal. So we take books that point out the flaws in the church, point out the flaws in America, as it's hard to read in that regard.
I think in some ways when we look at this, it almost it does tackle likely our idol of our nation or our kingdom on earth, right? Versus the capital K, kingdom of God, manifesting throughout the entire earth, and being multinational, multi-ethnic, multilingual, and which, America has some of those elements, right? We're a nation of immigrants, and we have people from, our community is, I can drive to any shopping center and I'm offered so many different types of great food from all over the world because we're a community of immigrants. And there's cool little glimpses of heaven on earth that have been realized in our communities and country. But yeah, I do think it almost takes down the idol. It attacks it of, this is not heaven though, as much as we can think it is, and we've come so far, but it's not the kingdom. God's building a global kingdom, and so I think having that healthy distinction is sometimes gets hard, right, for us to have pride in where we're at, but also understand that our ultimate citizenship isn't here, it's in heaven, as Peter said, so I think that's what's really hard to cause you to grit your teeth and feel a little uncomfortable, but it's good sometimes to feel uncomfortable over these things.
Yep. Agreed. You talked a little bit about progress, and as I think about it, and I think this came to mind because I heard an interview from a former Washington State governor. So the governor that was overseeing the state during the late 60s, early 70s. And he was talking about how it used to be a lot easier or a lot more clear on where to fight racial injustice because there were laws on the books.
Right.
There were just very obvious things where whites were treated different than blacks codified in law. And I talked about it with my dad, and he said he remembers coming home from college and having a long discussion with his dad, long, pretty intense discussion, argument about redlining in Seattle as they were putting an end to that. So, I mean, that's just a couple of years before I was born. But so there's been significant progress. Those laws have been taken off the books. So segregation is over. Redlining is over. A lot of the overt media stereotyping that sometimes that you bring up that I wasn't even aware of. A lot of those things have been changed. But what's next for us as we just realize that that sin is pervasive. That we're never going to fully get to a point where we treat each other like we're truly made in the image of God. But what are the next steps for America, according to Tisby, to combat racism in our time?
His last chapter, he gives quite a few things. I'd encourage anyone who, to read the book, especially the last chapter, the options he gives. One of the main ones he points out as controversial is reparations, and he points out how Germany, how much they have already given to Jewish communities in light of post World War II. Points out that I didn't realize that we had made some sort of reparations for Japanese Americans post World War II, concentration camps here, and then even with not every Native American community, but we have. I'm from California, and I guess that filled that in. That I didn't realize that's part of reparations for us taking their land and so forth. He talks about reparations there and some options for just really combating the systemic inequalities of income inequality based on centuries of that, and from grandparents and great grandparents not being able to qualify for business loans or home loans and things of that sort, only being able to buy homes in poorer neighborhoods, which then if they're in a poor neighborhood, they're likely set up for poor education systems. So we're split up. We're not segregated legally anymore, but we are segregated, and so just unequal opportunities, those types of things. So reparations was one of the big ones that he points to. He's big on taking down Confederate monuments, especially those enacted post-Civil War in the Jim Crow era that were, predominantly erected to enact fear, right? And remind people of their place, even though it wasn't in the law anymore necessarily, but to intimidate. He calls us to learn from Black church and diverse church at large, just thinking, that theology done, I've been challenged by this. I don't know about you, but, just looking at my books and who I study and learn from theology and do theology with through their works, like, when I only do theology with, white scholars or white male scholars, you're just like, how much of the body I'm leaving out. And so, I'm doing theology with, I'm telling the foot, I have no need for you. But, and so, he encourages us to do that. He, Juneteenth, he calls for, a holiday and stuff like that. But then he encourages us to get involved with modern civil rights movements. You think of things like Flint, Michigan, still not having clean water, racism in media. The separation of immigrant children at the border that's been going on for quite a few, at least over a decade, right? Me Too movement, mass incarceration, education reform. You think of access to good education. It's not, our kids are coming through on different levels, right? They're getting a different education in some of these different communities that are largely separated by race because of income inequality, which goes back to redlining and inability to be offered a loan. So, but I think the big thing he points out is he uses this acronym ARC, which stands for awareness, relationships, commitment. And so the first one, he says awareness, basically diversify, just educate yourself by becoming aware of other people's experiences in life within the church and outside of the church. So documentaries and movies, things like 13th on Netflix or Selma, just learning about these different experiences, podcasts. And, he encourages us to follow people from different voices and thoughts, worldviews on social media. I think of The Social Dilemma out right now. I'm not sure if you watched that, but that's a pretty scary movie, showing us how much, our intake is becoming an echo chamber, and we're slowly not listening to people. And it's essentially telling the foot, I have no need of you. I have no need of knowing your walk of life. Whereas we really should be reading from across the spectrum and following people from across the spectrum, rather than unfollow culture on Facebook, where we can they post something we don't like, they post support of Biden or support of Trump or support of a third party, and we're like, unfollow. Diversify, become aware of people's walks of life, relationships, just build relationships, assess, what is your friend group like? Do we actually have good relationships with people from different walks of life and people of color? And just humbly try and have deep conversations with them. Ask them, what's America been like for them? What has the church been like for them? Have you felt, how does it feel being in more of a white church or vice versa, or things like that? Just learning that, I think, allows us to see the world through them. Just appreciating the image of God in them and his character, manifesting and being expressed through them. And then, the last one was commitment. So the awareness, the relationships, and then commitment. And that was really, just the first two create a burden for the struggles of others. But he asks, does it lead you to action? And he calls us to commit for action. So whether it be if we're artists or activists, create something, whether it be some sort of art, or if we're teachers, some sort of Sunday school class or podcast, poetry. If we're involved in join an organization for racial justice, donate, speak with our candidates, elected officials, our pastors and leaders, which I know you have been getting conversations, as have I. Just commit to not stand on the sidelines. One of the big things we talk about with our students on Wednesday morning in this conversation is, history it is a river. And if unless we are actively walking against the current, we're going to be taken down. There is no standing on the sidelines. We're going to go with the wave of injustice. If not, we've got to step against the current, take the hard walks through a river, go upstream as Jesus followers. And that's often the way of Jesus in all avenues of life, but in particular in confronting injustices and inequalities. So there really is no standing on the sideline. If you stand on the sideline, you're going to be complicit in the ways that are contrary to treating people as image bearers. So, Tisby said, Christians today say that many Christians today say that they would have been active participants in the civil rights movement 50 years ago, but he said now in the midst of this new civil rights movement is their chance to prove it. And so that's the scary one. Yeah, how do we do that? So yeah, we try and contextualize that, like you brought up the sex trafficking that came about in Bellevue a few years ago. We talked about that on Wednesday morning. We talked about just how we got rid of slavery on this country, but we just exported it, and a lot of our companies are built on slaves, and our economy is built on the exportation of slavery in other countries. The Seattle Times have been doing the chocolate research, right? And like over 90% of the world's chocolate is fueled by child slaves. And the heart behind that is, it's money, right? Comfort, money, status. And so leisure, luxury, those types of things. And so those at what point do we say, okay, my M&Ms and my vice of eating my peanut M&Ms this week is worth more than the image of God and this kid who got kidnapped to go pick these cocoa beans.
That is so amazing to think about that, Tyler. Just I think it's one of his themes about how it morphs over time. And you say that, and I immediately think of Wilberforce and his telling people to do without their sugar because the sugar is coming from slave plantations. It's just
and people were like, "How my tea is going to be bitter?" But is it worth what that's doing to someone?
Yeah.
And so, it's really challenging.
Good.
But those little choices, the thing we say most is, injustice is not usually just these giant things. It is 1,001 tiny decisions that often are made passively, that compile into a lifestyle that we're going with the current rather than making the little choices of maybe I try and afford a little bit more in my budget to pay for fair trade things a little bit more, even just one choice, maybe just a bag of coffee a month. It changes things, but that's how change happens, one decision at a time rather than
that go with the flow.
Right.
That just fits with that discussion of complicit.
Right.
Whereas courageous takes a deliberate step in order to show our dearly loved brothers that we care for them, our dearly loved vulnerable sisters that we care for them. And you went through a pretty long list of ways it's practical, that last chapter. And I really found that to be helpful. I mean, if this book is a sermon with lots of historical examples, then that's definitely the implication part of it. And, Tisby, it's equal time. And he's going to come at things from a little different perspective than I do. But I think it's also good as we read through this as Christians to realize these are not all biblically sanctioned or required ways to fix the problem. But I think it would be beautiful if all of us, even allowing for our different political approach to it, that we can look at problems like inequality of income. And I think Tisby said, I think it was 16%. Yeah, colossal wealth gap. So the average white family wealth is 16 times what the average Black family wealth is. And that's just awful, awful. So how do we, if someone is is more on the liberal end of things, I think they'll probably start talking about a government solution. If they're on the right side of things, on the politically right side of things, they would say, well, let's have some nonprofits get to work.
Right.
But either way, I think both of us should say, let's fix this.
Yeah, do something, right? Yeah.
Yeah, let's do something. I mean, he has a ton of great ideas. I love in 199, he's just talking about, how about a year of Jubilee? Let's pull some money together for debt forgiveness. Let's take some deliberate steps for those children to get educational opportunities. Let's step up and see if we can't help with down payments on houses and help fund some of these Black ministries from Black churches that have fantastic ideas that are really effective. Let's step up and do those. So although Tisby often seems to come from things from a more liberal perspective than I am, I love that he's identifying some of these clear problems. And it seems like there could be some real partnership, some real both interdenominational and left and right working together to actually solve problems in a way that works. Right. So I enjoyed it. Yeah. Any closing thoughts on it? Things we didn't cover before we wrap this up?
I mean, there's so much. So I think my closing thought and encouragement is to read the book and prayerfully read the book. If you got to take it page by page or chapter by chapter, however, there are some just gut-wrenching sections that cause you to pause. But I encourage Jesus followers to work your way through it. Similar to how we read the rough accounts in the Old Testament and things that people of God have worked through. I mean, some of these people are brothers and sisters in Christ, and they're all image bearers of God. And reading what they went through, and what people in our shoes put them through, in our places, were complicit in allowing to happen or compromise and actually actively participating in it, I think is helpful for us to learn so that we can get to the redemption, right? We've got to understand, what is our Reformed mantra? It's guilt, grace, gratitude. We got to understand the guilt, where the sin was, in order to see the grace and respond to God in gratitude and a life in serving him. And so I think even with history, seeing sin, seeing the problem, seeing it manifest in different avenues of culture and society, seeing that guilt of our people, our collective people, the corporate sin that we've had. And then it allows us to, receive grace, but also step forward in gratitude that, we don't have to live that way anymore. We can make new choices. We can be different. That doesn't have to define us. Yeah, I'd encourage that. There's also, I don't know if you watch, he has a documentary series that goes through each chapter on Amazon Prime. So if you got Prime Video, you can go through it as well. And he basically talks through the chapter. It's really good. So
that's good. So the people that don't enjoy reading can take that shortcut and just turn the TV on. Yeah.
I've got the audiobook too, and he narrates it. And yeah, I mean, he's got a very a nice voice that you can listen to for 8 hours or 6 if you listen to it on 1.25 like I do. But yeah,
that's great. Well, I encourage people. I found the book super helpful, and I think what you said about talking through that guilt or working through that guilt first. I think he says his purpose of this book isn't to cause guilt, but to cause grief. And I think godly sorrow that later turns to repentance is what God wants for us. And I think it's okay for us to love our country and to also say, man, there is an awful lot to grieve. And I think grieving that is going to help us empathize. And I think whether you're on the right or on the left, as far as solutions, I think all of us can just take some time and just say, man, this just, it wasn't right what happened. It wasn't, and that ought to help us empathize and spur us on to make this a more perfect union, to paraphrase historical figures.
Paul, I think that one of the biggest pushbacks I encounter is, well, there's nothing in the law today. And I think what this helps us see is how much sin as a generational thing affects generations. I mean, we see that from Genesis, right? We see, I mean, technically the gospel is, Jesus came because we are still reaping the benefits, the results of our first father Adam's sin, right? And so we see that sin affects generations. I've learned this from my own counseling and seeing how much sin can affect entire lineage for generations. And unless we become aware of it and actively grieve it and choose to and seek help to live differently, we're just going to be complicit again. And so understanding that
in different ways, somehow fitting the pattern, but in different ways.
Right.
That's a good word. Well, thank you, Tyler. Thank you for taking this hour to discuss the book. Thank you for courageously pushing forward with a controversial book. And I want our kids to be able to think through it. I imagine that if people read it, that there'll be some parts where they grieve, some parts that they, in many ways, the sermon parts, they'll say, yep, that's absolutely right. And there'll be parts where it's likely that they'll disagree with his solution to the problem. But I think it's valuable for us to read this, to go through the discomfort, to take time to grieve. And if you want to pick it up, either Tyler or I won't tell him to do this, but I certainly would be happy to talk with people about the book if they'd like to discuss it.
Definitely.
All right, brother. Thank you. And thank you all for listening, and hope you guys tune in again.